Okay, welcome back to the Beanbag. So, today I'm going to be looking at Star Trek The Next Generation figures, starting with the Season 3 through Season 7 uniforms, which is really where we get into the Wave 1 figures that came out when Playmates started their toy line, which I will show those 6 crew members that they made, and we'll discuss that more in just a moment. And then I'll show you all the other characters that they made, because they actually made a ton of characters from those seasons. And then I have a whole lot of other figures that I have made in that particular uniform line. And so, let's get into it. So first was Captain Picard in his sort of captain's leisure outfit. This was introduced during Season 5. It was first seen in the episode Darmok, and it became really popular. And of course, I believe that Patrick Stewart really enjoyed wearing this because it was a lot more comfortable than the pajama-looking uniforms that they had to wear all the time. But they decided to make this the primary figure. Also added sort of some variation to that Wave 1 of figures. And I love the fact that this is the one that comes with his Make It So fingers. Then this is the highly controversial battle-scarred Commander Riker. As I mentioned in previous video, his chest, leg, and arm all scratched up. He's got this ridiculous posing with the hands again. The head's actually a really nice, decent sculpt. The eyes could have used, or maybe it's the eyebrows. I've always kind of thought that, but the rest looks really good. But again, yeah, that's the grabby hand. And the funny thing is, his figure came with a little briefcase that literally the only way he could hold the briefcase was to slide the handle up around the outside of his hand, so then it looked like he was carrying the briefcase in this position, which looked absolutely ridiculous. Then we had Data, which this is actually one I really liked the little features that it comes with, as far as the panels on his arm that opens up. You can sort of see in there, and there is actually some detailing in there. It's hard to see. It's better to see in the panel that's on his back. You see they actually have like little circuits and that kind of thing going on. And they also had that little hole in the back there. And that was one of the little tools that he came with. You could actually like press it in there and have Geordi running scans of him on his back. And now the only thing I didn't care for with this figure was the hand positions. It actually resulted in that with him, all of his tools, all of his accessories had to come with little wraps that you actually like slid around his hand. His tricorder had to have this belt strapped around his hand in order for him to hold it. Unlike most of the other figures, especially the Geordi figure ended up becoming one of the most used bodies overall. So, yeah, and on that, we'll go ahead and look at Geordi next, which you're going to end up seeing this figure from the waist down, or from the neck down, a lot in as far as the custom figures that I've got. So, yeah, this is actually, even though this was from the Wave 1 of figures, this is actually one of the later waves where they started gluing his visor onto his head so it couldn't be taken off. And the reason for that was that the big complaint was getting lost, and that's the reason I taken the ones that I have, I keep in a special bag so that they don't get lost. But I also have made a mold so that I can make duplicates, so that if anybody wants one, I can send them a duplicated visor, and they're easy to paint, little silver and gold paint, and it looks great. But yeah, this one, it's because of the fact that his body is actually quite generic that made this one become so important to the rest of the toy line. And I'll show that a little bit more as we look at the rest. Next, we're going to look at Worf. Because, again, Worf ended up with some of the strange body positioning. Now, the good thing about this hand is that they did make it so it could hold the Klingon weapons that he came with. But this closed fist thing, really the only thing you could do was kind of like take the bat'leth and stick one of the bat'leth blades down inside there. And that didn't exactly look right. The other problem was the sculpting of his legs. You had to particularly pose his legs in this extreme action pose like he's ready to jump. But I mean, like I said, the good thing is you kind of do him like that and he just looks like he's ready to fight. Unlike Riker, who looked like he was ready to grab somebody's boobs. Now, as I mentioned in a previous video about the Season 1 Troi, during the first wave, they put out this Troi, which, like I said, this was the sort of lavender-colored outfit she wore a lot during Seasons 4 and 5. And like I said, I think a little bit in Season 6. It started in Season 6, they started... that's when they started having her actually wear her standard blue uniform, which I have that figure as well, more frequently, and occasionally mixing it up with one of the other jumpsuit style outfits, as well as one of the other custom figures I'll show you here in just a moment. Now, the next figure is actually someone who's not a crew member, but still wearing one of the uniforms, which is Q, wearing the captain's uniform. This is actually one of the tallest figures that they made, and I'll grab Geordi here. You can actually see how much taller Q is by comparison. About half an inch taller than most of the regular characters, and again, he's got his Make It So fingers just on the other hand versus Picard. But I've always liked this sculpt of John de Lancie. It really does look like him. It's like all of the figures, there's a slightly cartoonish element to the sculpts, and I hate using that word, but that's kind of what it is it's not super realistic, but it's also not full-on cartoony. It's a nice line in between somewhere. Another figure that they made from those seasons, the seasons 3 through 5, was Lieutenant Barclay. He was one of the engineers, if you're not familiar with him. He was only in a handful of episodes during The Next Generation. I think he started in about season 4. And also then, of course, became very prominent in Star Trek Voyager during its later seasons. This was actually a completely original sculpt. New legs, new body, new head and everything. But they did reuse this body later on for a few other figures as well. Specifically one that I don't currently have, which is the Dr. Bashir. I do intend to get that one as soon as I possibly can. And I almost sort of skipped, because this is one of the funny bits. So when they did that very first wave of figures, it was the first 6 figures I showed you: Picard, Riker, Data, Geordi, Worf, and Troi. And the reason was that they wanted 10 figures in the lines. They had 6 of the Starfleet officers. Then they had the Gowron was sometimes labeled as generically a Klingon. They had a generic Romulan, a generic Ferengi, which unfortunately, and we'll talk about this later on, they used the Ferengi from the very first episode that the Ferengi were in, and not how the Ferengi looked through most of the remainder of the 7 seasons of the show. But they left out Dr. Crusher in that first wave completely. And so when they got around to the second wave, they did finally make a Dr. Crusher. And they made her in this lab coat, which, as you'll recognize from one of the custom figures that I made in the Season 1 figures, is that I literally used the exact same one. The only difference was what was going up around the collar area. Also in that second wave, they did Wesley as in his cadet uniform, and this has become one of the ones that I use a lot in custom building, because it is so generic looking as far as the uniform goes. So it's been quite helpful. I do have intentions to make a few other cadets as well. I've actually used the same body, and you'll see it when we get to Deep Space Nine that I used it to make a Nog. Also in Season 6, Riker found out that he had a sort of twin, a transporter twin, but this one wasn't as evil as when Kirk had a transporter twin. Anyways, so he ended up just trying to go by Thomas Riker. They literally used the exact same sculpt, but they did like they did with that Season 2 Riker, and they just painted over the scar areas on his arm and his leg. And everything else about this sculpt is exactly the same. Which I didn't actually point this out on the other figures. He also had a slightly odd posing. You had to kind of position his legs like that. I'm so glad that they moved away from that on later figures. They did also then make, and she was only in about a dozen or so episodes during Season 6 and 7, was Ensign Ro Laren. She was one of the first major Bajoran characters to show up on the show. And actually, I think she started in Season 5, now that I think about it. Really good face sculpt on this Michelle Forbes likeness. Plus, it finally got them to make a female uniform. Which, once they did, they started reusing it as much as they possibly could. And I'll show you that more here in just a moment. And, well, actually, I'll show you one of them right now, which was one of the 1701 Tasha Yars. Now, she was supposed to be in the uniform like she was wearing in yesterday's Enterprise, but they didn't attempt to do anything like the yesterday's Enterprise uniform, which had the black cuffs around the sleeves, the silver belt. The collar was actually a box collar that came up. It didn't have the little V down here. They just took that exact same Ro Laren body, repainted it, and put the Tasha Yar head from Season 1 on there, and called that the yesterday's Enterprise Tasha Yar. But I like the fact that it puts her in a later season uniform, which was kind of fun. They then made, if I can grab them, a couple of more reuses of that exact same body. So they did Dr. Crusher, Counselor Troi, and Jadzia Dax from Deep Space Nine, all wearing the exact same uniform. Which Dax, you only see her wear this in the first episode of Deep Space Nine, and then never again. But that's fine. I like having more figures in this uniform. The fact that they're all science officers is a little amusing to me. But yeah, so they did finally do all of them wearing these uniforms, which was really good, especially for Dr. Crusher, because it meant that you could finally have a Dr. Crusher who could sit down. The other good thing, and I actually forgot to point this out, is that they actually did make one slight adjustment. One of the complaints that people started having about the sculpts, especially for the female characters, was that their hands were so small and dainty they couldn't really hold anything. And if you look real closely, the hand on these sculpts, these later sculpts, is just a little bit bigger than the Ro Laren, made to where it can actually hold something. So that was actually one real nice improvement they did keep around. I do have the Commander Sisko wearing the same uniform, but I will be showing that in a different video because that's part of my special collection that gets kept in a locked up box away from people. Now the last figure, as far as the ones that were standard made before we get into the customs, was the mail-away exclusive of Lieutenant junior grade Jean-Luc Picard as a science officer in the episode Tapestry? Yes. Had a moment. Which, funny enough, is actually the same episode where he's wearing the movie version of the uniform, the maroon, the monster maroon version of the uniform. And this was a mail away, I think, with the Star Trek the magazine, if I remember correctly. And again, this is literally just that exact same Geordi body. In fact, I'll grab Geordi just to show you. It is 100% the exact same sculpt. In fact, what's really funny is, so if you look really closely at Geordi's neck, you see the 3 pips that are sculpted on. And if you look here, you can see the 3 pips sculpted on, but only 2 of them are painted. And that became a big thing that they started doing with a lot of figures. You'll see that on some of the Deep Space Nine figures when we get into that video. Is that and what's really hilarious is when they would, if they only had 2 or 3 pips sculpted on, and then they would put more dots beyond that. I always found that hilarious. It's like, oh yeah, we didn't have enough pips. But, so... Oh, I actually did forget, there was this one other reuse of the sculpt, the Chief O'Brien. I almost forgot about him. Again, literally the exact same sculpt. And again, you can see he's actually got 3 pips. This wasn't a custom. This is one that they made this way. And again, the exact same sculpt of the body. Like I said, became one of the most popular ones that they just kept, that they made, and it's become hugely popular in the customized figures circles as well. So now we get into the custom figures that I have made from these seasons. First is a Counselor Troi wearing the blue... I'm never real sure what to call this, because it wasn't really a skirt, because it had the big... she wore pants underneath it. But it's the sort of turquoisey light blue outfit that she wore mostly during season 4, I believe it was. A little bit of 3, maybe. Which this was really just the exact same. If you look closely, you can tell it's this exact same Troi. I just took and redid the collar, and I made this skirt to come on it, and then repainted the whole thing. Real simple, but it gives me a variation on that one. One of the things that I got to thinking about is as a custom was, later on, Worf went on to Deep Space Nine, and he switched back over to Command Division and was wearing red again. And I always thought that it would have been great to have seen him wearing this uniform, and I did use the later long-haired Worf head and used the season 3 through 7 Worf body, just painted the maroonish red color like the rest of their uniforms to make that. That's sort of my own little personal enjoyment one. Again, and the comic books that I talked about, because I am a decent fan of Star Trek Voyager, they showed Janeway and Tuvok especially, and so I decided I would make Janeway as she would appear when she would have been a slightly younger officer, just before the days of Voyager. In fact, this could be her as a captain. This is really just the Rolaren sculpt with a Janeway head on it. But this could have been when she was first officer on, I believe it was the Rutledge? Somebody will probably correct me if I'm wrong about that. But, yeah, this is slightly younger Janeway. This is the pre-Voyager Janeway here. And then also a pre-Voyager Tuvok. And again, this is that exact same Geordi body. In fact, this time I didn't even have to repaint the hands. With a Tuvok head on it. And the rest of the rest of these are all mostly original characters. I did do a Ensign or crewman Simon Tarsus. He's, what was the name of that episode? The Drumhead, I think, where they are doing an investigation and they find out that there's this crewman, medical officer on board who is 3/4 human, 1/4 Romulan, and he's been hiding that fact. And they think that, and this particular admiral thinks that he might be a Romulan spy. Well, anyways, the figure for this is actually, the head is actually one of those cadet, you're going to hear me mention those a lot, the Cadet Picard figure, and I custom sculpted those ears just to give him the slightly pointed Romulan ears. Changed the hair color just a little bit to give him a slightly different hair color, and then used that Barclay torso, painted the science medical blue-green color to give him that. The rest of these are all completely original figures. This one's sort of a play on the idea, which I know I mentioned in the season 1, that I'm currently working on a Ensign Mendon, who was a Benzite. Well, earlier on I did actually make this, which is the idea that maybe he did continue to be in Starfleet, and so later on he would have been wearing a uniform like this. Still has his sort of rebreather circulator device on there. This is a Commander Riker figure, which I actually took and removed the scarring completely, and like you can barely see where I've covered it up here on the leg if you look really closely. But yeah, they had made a Mordock figure, which was a character who appeared in season 1 when Wesley went to take his cadet entrance exam, and Mordock was one of the other people there. And then in season 2, Wesley comes on the bridge, sees Ensign Mendon, and for a moment thinks that it's Mordock, and to show that racism still exists in the future, I guess. Of course, the fact that it was the exact same alien species played by the exact same actor a year later kind of makes it understandable why Wesley wouldn't recognize him. So then I made it's literally just the Q figure that I have converted into an Andorian captain, because during that time period of Star Trek there was apparently no Andorians around for some reason. We had seen them in the original series a couple of times, and then that was it until Star Trek Enterprise came around. That's not entirely true. We did see one for a brief 2 seconds in Data's Daughter episode, LOL. I can't remember if that was the name of the episode now. But yeah, that was the only... When LOL was trying to figure out what she wanted to look like, for a second they showed us an Andorian, and then moved on, and that was the only Andorian we saw for the entire Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and even Voyager didn't have any, which I always thought was strange. But anyways, so I made this Andorian captain, because we know that they're in Starfleet. And what's actually really neat is I took, in order to make the antenna, what I did is I actually drilled a tiny little hole into the skull, and then I took, and if you know the little bread ties that they make for tying up the bag of bread, I took one of those and I stuck it down in there, and then cut it off to a certain length, and drilled a hole, stuck it down in there, cut it to a certain length, and I used super glue to glue it in. And then I actually took, and I've got some liquid rubber stuff that I took and I dipped down into, and then I painted several coats of acrylic and Mod Podge over it to make it to where you can still kind of flex them, bend them around a little bit, and position them however you want. So I'm actually quite happy with the fact that that worked out. And you can see it's got a little bit of pink there on the tip, the pink and white tips. One of the other aliens that was seen, I've got two aliens here that were seen in Star Trek the Motion Picture. And if I ever get some more Star Trek Motion Picture uniforms, I'll probably make some of them in those. But then we saw them in that movie, and then never again until Star Trek Discovery did we get I believe he's a Rigelian, if I remember correctly. Or Saurian. God, I'm having a brain fart moment. But anyways, yeah, in the motion picture he had more pinkish colored eyes, which did look a little bit funny. And in Star Trek Discovery they made him, in fact, in Discovery there's a officer on Discovery, whose name I can't remember right this minute, but they made him with black eyes, and I like the look of the black eyes much better. So I took one of those Geordi figures, in fact that's even Geordi's head under there, and sculpted this entirely over it. And I did the same thing with another species that was seen only in Star Trek the Motion Picture. Again, I'm drawing a blank and I'll have to caption it on what these guys were called. I always loved the look of them because they had, these butt heads with a metal mask, breathing mask over the front of them. And, so yeah, loved those. And then lastly is technically someone who was a species that was never in Star Trek. If you've ever seen the 1988 movie Alien Nation, so the species from Alien Nation, I think they were called the Techahoacon. I can't remember. I remember it started with a T. They only say it like once in the movie, so give me a break. But I loved that movie. The series I still need to rewatch. But I decided to make a science officer based off of one of the characters from that. So that's the final figure in the Next Generation seasons 3 through 7 that I've got for you today. Alright, thank you, and catch me next time. If you enjoy my videos and want to see more, please like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon. Also, you can support the show by signing up on Patreon, or head over to Zazzle to pick up prints of my artwork, prints on canvas, t-shirts, and other merch. You can find me on social media. For more information and updates on the channel, all info is below. If you didn't enjoy the video, why are you still here? Do you want a song? Ba, ba, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, them, 3 bags full. One for the master, who can screw himself. You can listen to somebody else.